All right, welcome to the last installment of Chapter 2. You are going to be able to answer the last three questions on that guide of reading. I think those are 15, 16, and 17. Questions that include things like, what were the motives behind the founding of the colony of Georgia and the realities of the settlement? We're also going to look at a little bit to the south, the Spanish colonies in North America. So how were Native Americans and Spanish colonies and what became the United States were treated differently than the natives in South and Central America, and why did that happen? And then compare the treatment of natives in both English and Spanish colonies. How did that kind of work? So we're going to answer all three of those questions. Let's start off kind of where we were at last time. At the end of the last video, we talked about how South Carolina had really kind of started this political and social harmony. They had kind of got together for a lot of reasons to protect against outside sources, outside interests like the Spanish and the French that were in the region. Kind of directly around them in the north and in the south and in the southwest, to protect against Native American attacks and really to protect against slave uprisings. So South Carolina saw this harmony right around the time that Georgia was getting created. Georgia was really a good piece of news for South Carolina. It provided a buffer between South Carolina and those foreign threats in Florida. So on the map, if you kind of know South Carolina, Georgia directly south, and then Florida would come right after Georgia. So there is a nice buffer between that threat. James Oglethorpe and a couple of his buddies were given proprietorship to govern kind of Georgia as they see fit. Now there's a little bit of misconception that Georgia was set up as a haven for criminals. That's really not true. The rumor has it that England kind of opened up their debtor's prison and just said, you take them to America and let them go to Georgia. That's where they're going to set up. Not really true. Really what Georgia wanted to do is they wanted to provide for the worthy poor. What we mean by that, or what they meant by that, was people that are poor, they don't have much, but they are willing to work hard. So they're going to use these hard workers as a means to produce for the colony or the country of England. This colony was going to produce and be able to ship their goods back. And they're going to utilize it by giving things to the poor. Now, how they were going to do this, how they were going to attract that worthy poor, was if you agreed to go to Georgia, you were going to get 50 acres, tools, and a year's worth of supplies in order to tend your land. And really kind of what England was hoping for is those people would be able to make silk and wine that they could ship back to England. That meant England didn't have to buy their silk and wine from other people. Remember, a lot of silk came from China. They didn't really want to do that. They'd like to produce it on their own so that way they could buy it directly from their own colonies. This agricultural utopia was set up so everybody, all these hardworking people, would be able to produce these things, again, benefiting the English royal family and the government of England. Now, if you could pay more, if you could pay your way over, and you had some money, then you could receive more than 50 acres of land. If you could pay your way over, you received more land. And a lot of this, those people that could pay their way over tended to be European Jews that settled in Georgia, from countries like Germany. They came over and they had enough money to pay their own way, so they would receive more than 50 acres. It wasn't entirely European Jews, but they made up a pretty good portion of the people that had more than 50 acres. Now, the government also did a couple other things to establish this agricultural utopia. They tried to teach people how to farm, best practices. They also outlawed slavery. They outlawed hard liquor. And they placed a limit on how much individual land somebody could own. So you could not own more than 500 acres of land as an individual. Now, a lot of people were upset about this. A lot of people felt this put them at a distinct disadvantage. Now, the liquor part was probably just because they wanted liquor for whatever reason. They must have liked it. So that was a sticking point for them. The 500 acres, a lot of people felt put them at a disadvantage. If I was going to make my fortune, if I could have 1,000 or 2,000 acres, I could obviously make more money than if I had 500. So they wanted as much land as humanly possible, and Georgia limited that amount. And then slavery was free labor, so they felt like those people in South Carolina that were able to utilize slaves to farm the plantations were a distinct advantage than those that resided in Georgia. So there's a lot of people that complained that slavery should be legal in Georgia. Now, before the charter converted to a royal colony, back to a royal colony. Remember, we said Oglethorpe had 21 years. Him and his friends had 21 years as the sole proprietor. Now, after that, it would go to a royal colony and it would be set up. So right before it did that, Oglethorpe and the rest relented, and they did allow hard liquor. They did allow slavery, and they did away with the land ownership laws that were put in place, the limits that were put in place. Before that, we saw a lot of people that were going to South Carolina. A lot of defectors said, like, yeah, if you're gonna tie my hands, it's easier to make my fortune in South Carolina. Their laws are more advantageous. So in order to stop that, before it went to a royal colony, Georgia did make those changes. Now, a lot of farmers went from, instead of producing wine and silk, a lot of those farmers changed what they were producing and started producing like rice, like South Carolina was. They wanted to kind of pattern themselves after what they thought was a successful colony in South Carolina. They certainly were economically successful, at least. Now, to the south of Georgia was Florida. Remember, before England had kind of set up North American colonies, the Spanish had been the first really to populate the region. And they set up colonies in Florida. They also had some outposts in the Southwest. The two biggest ones were in St. Augustine and in Santa Fe. And there was a distinct difference in the way that Native Americans were treated in the Spanish colonies as opposed to, or at least the Native Americans in North America, as opposed to the way the Spanish had treated the Native Americans in South America and Central America. And really the major reason why is because there was no money to be made from those Native Americans. The Spanish settlements were not very profitable. There was a lot of thought by the Spanish leadership to abandon their posts in North America and concentrate just on what they were doing in South America and the Caribbean. If it wasn't for Catholic missionaries who ensured the leadership in Spain that they were going to convert all these Native Americans to Catholicism, they probably would have abandoned their posts in North America. But because of that, because they didn't, really their big deal was spreading Christian ideas, the Spanish language, all of that. So that was kind of the big difference. And there were still dangers of things kind of going on. There were dangers of soldiers and settlers. They did try to get Indian labor, so there was a lot of issues. Now, there was a difference in the way that the Spanish were treated by both. That Native Americans were treated by both the Spanish and the English. The Native Americans resented treatment by both the English and the Spanish. Obviously, they were both looking to profit off relationships with Native Americans through trade, through taking land. Both wanted to profit. The big difference was only England was successful at doing that, at least in North America. The other thing was, and the similarity was, the natives definitely fought back against both the English and the Spanish as they tried to settle. We've kind of detailed in some of the other videos some of the attacks. There was a there was an incident in Texas where 400 people were killed after the Pueblos had kind of pushed back on their settlement in Texas. So there was all kinds of incidents that really occurred between the natives and both the English and Spanish there. Like I said, and the natives were pretty resentful of those efforts. So, okay, that is the end of chapter 2. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. If not, I will see you on the next one.